Pleasant good evening and a hearty welcome to our viewing audience tonight. And we want to welcome you to the second session of Critical Conversations on Race. Tonight's topic is a very interesting one and a very riveting one. Our theme tonight is why white evangelicals don't get the black struggle. And I can just guarantee that this question has been discussed over and over again around tables of communities of faith, particularly in the Black community. But this particular discussion we're bringing to a public forum, it's a discussion that's not meant to be polemic or antagonistic, but a discussion among friends on this issue that has come to the fore, particularly again in communities of faith. We have an esteemed panelist tonight. My name is Carswell Leonard, and I serve as the presiding bishop here in the United States Virgin Islands, as well as the British Virgin Islands and the ABC Islands, which comprise Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. So at this time, I'm going to invite our other panelists to introduce themselves to you, so you can know who they are. We're going to begin with Dr. Laney, and then in whatever order the other ones want to introduce themselves. So, Dr. Laney? There he is.
Okay, I am Clarence Laney. I'm the pastor of Monument of Faith Church in Durham, North Carolina. I also serve as the regional bishop for the North Carolina Churches of God of Prophecy here in North Carolina.
Thank you, Dr. Laney.
A pleasant good evening, my brothers. Good evening to all those who are listening. My name is Roger Ball, and I serve as the executive pastor of Family Worship Center here in the Bronx. My wife and I also serve as regional family ministries director, and secularly, I serve as a professor at Fordham University and the supervisor of social workers for the Borough of the Bronx in New York City Department of Education. Welcome all.
Thank you, Dr. Ball.
Good evening. I am Stephanie Scotton. I am a pastor's daughter, an evangelist's daughter. I'm an associate pastor's wife, and I have served as a children's minister for more than 30 years. I also served as a state youth director. I served as a state camping director, and I'm presently assisting our local church here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in our local area for social media and online communications.
Okay, welcome, Stephanie.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kenneth Benjamin, and I'm the lead pastor for the New Creation Church here in Texas City, Texas. Welcome to our panel.
Okay, thank you, Pastor Benjamin. All right, those are esteemed panelists for the night. We do have a special guest speaker with us tonight, who is Dr. Tim Conder. I'm going to read a very concise biography, after which Dr. Conder will make his presentation regarding the subject at hand. After that, we have some prepared questions from the panelists that we're going to engage Dr. Conder with. After that, we'll open the floor for questions from our esteemed audience, and then we'll wrap up. So it's going to be a very, very exciting evening. Look forward to your input. So Dr. Conder, I'm going to read his bio. Tim Conder is the co-president of the Black Mountain School of Theology and Community, a school that builds congregations and civic organizations by teaching practices of systemic social change for justice and equity to key leaders. He is also organized with Durham CAN, and that stands for Congregations, Associations, and Neighborhoods, for 15 years, helping lead local campaigns for living wage jobs, criminal justice reform, and affordable housing, and national campaigns against usury and gun violence. Tim has served as a pastor for 35 years, congregations both large and small, and is the founding pastor of Emmaus Way Church in Durham, North Carolina, leading that vibrant activist congregation from 2005 to 2018. He completed a PhD in cultural studies in 2018 at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, researching theopolitical social movements, the identity pathways to social justice activism for Protestant Christian and racial justice/equality in public education. Tim is the author of 4 books and a contributor to many publications for both the Academy and the Church. His most recent books are Organizing Church, Grassroots Practices for Embodying Change in Your Organization, Your Community, and Our World, published in 2017 with Juan Carrillo and Danny Parker Moore. He's also authored Mentoring Students of Color, Naming the Politics of Race, Social Class, Gender, and Power, published in 2019. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure and with great excitement and anticipation that I introduce to you our guest speaker for this evening, Dr. Tim Conder.
Hey, good evening, everybody, old friends and new. It's a delight to be with you this evening. And I think what the plan is, I'm going to share for a few minutes a little bit about my own background and some quick thoughts, and then we'll engage a little bit deeper. I want to congratulate the group here for raising such a critical question, because the idea of white evangelicalism and how it relates to systemic racism has probably been one of the most predominant questions that we're facing, not just politically in our culture, but also through churches. So thank you for raising this great question. A couple of things about me. Just wanted to establish, I grew up a red dirt, blue collar, redneck fundamentalist Baptist church. So I grew up in a community, a part of a rural community that was 100% white, and saw very clearly, I will share the stories of that, of the enmeshment of Christianity that I grew up in with racism. And it's an imprinter on my own life that I struggle with every day in every aspect of my work. I actually evangelicalism was a move to the left for me. I encountered evangelicalism basically through campus ministries, high school and college, and was challenged with this whole idea that perhaps there's a broader intellectual position to the faith that we held. My community was particularly anti-intellectual, the one that I grew up in, and I would say, through the ministries that I've done, the question of race in terms of life in the church, or more broadly in our society, is one that I have been slowly over time introduced to. I mentioned a story in the 1990s. I was working with a dear friend who was on our church staff and a member of the youth team that I led, and we were leading a retreat. She's a woman of color. And we were in Western North Carolina. And I remember saying to her, I was close with her kids and her husband, and I said, "This is such a great place to be. You ought to come back here with your husband and your kids." And she stopped me and she said, "Tim, this is not a place that Black people go, or certainly go safely." And it was the first time in my life that I considered, to my great embarrassment, there are places that people of color don't go in North Carolina or in our society. And, that was 25 years ago. And this has been a journey for me. One of the things that I would attribute to raising and constantly confronting the question of race to me has been a couple things. One has been through relationship, and particularly through organizing relationships. As I became a community organizer working with Bishop Laney in Durham Can in the early 2000s, and part of the clergy caucus, and working on issues like affordable housing and criminal justice reform and all of those things, I engaged the Black church in a way that I had not engaged up to that point in time. And through those very, very sacred relationships, was given a lens, particularly in how the Black church stands in a deep positional difference than the white church, and particularly conservative churches in our society. And I thank those friends. I can't tell you, Bishop Laney, how many times Dr. Davis pulled me aside and said, "Tim, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to tell you some Black church thinking and some Black pastor thinking in this moment, and I'm going to trust you with that knowledge." And so these were people who shaped me and mentored me and guided me on that. The other really significant part of my own journey has been in research. Over the last 10 years or so, I have researched particularly the moral movement in North Carolina and the work of Bishop Barber and other related types of social movements. And research and learning in terms of history and a broader sense of how race has been constituted religiously has been really critical to that. So that's a little bit of my own story, but I say very clearly, this is a journey that I'm on. It was a topic that was not raised in my early nurture and has only been something that I've really struggled with at the level that I have now for 20 to 25 years. I wanted to also just start with a soundbite. When I'm asked, and having come from an evangelical background and having served in two pretty large evangelical churches up into the around 2000 or so, I've often asked to speak in settings where people ask me to reflect on evangelicalism and my understanding of evangelicalism and its strengths and its weaknesses. And this is a soundbite that I use referring to white evangelicalism. And I call this often that white evangelicalism in the United States is part genius and part tragedy. The genius historically of evangelicalism has been its ability to forge brilliantly simple but engaging messages, what we call gospel, for their historical context. And if you look at historically through evangelicalism, particularly the last 300 to 400 years, as it's developed and certainly kind of become a distinct form in the United States, there has been genius messaging related to the social world that they're in. But I would also say the tragedy of white evangelicalism is they don't believe in their genius. They don't believe that their gospel that they preach and their practices are socially shaped. And that genius or that sense of not understanding their genius is tragic, and it's especially dangerous in terms of race and racism. Not being able to understand a broader context of whiteness, and particularly white supremacy in Western culture and how it's impacted the gospel is a blind spot that in many ways is a deep, tragic part of white evangelicalism. So that's a soundbite that I use. Let me offer just a couple of quick points that I think are going to come up in the panel conversation, but some people that have influenced my thinking on this. I had a tremendous privilege of taking a graduate seminar with Dr. Willie Jennings of Yale and formerly of Duke University. And one of the things that his course was entitled Christian Identity and the Formation of the Modern Racial World. And he was deeply interested in modern racism, particularly as it came out of colonialism and settler colonialism, and often said in class time and time again, you can't understand how we were formed without understanding that the missionary and a soldier and those who enslaved all came on the same ship. But one of the things that Dr. Jennings said very, very clearly in his coursework was the idea that modern Christianity, and this is one of the most faithful people I've ever met, he would say very clearly, has a diseased social imagination. And its social imagination has become diseased because it's formed around this modern notion of race. And he makes it very clear that also this manifestation of modern racism could not come about without dominant European and white Christianity. Christianity provided a logic and understanding that shaped racism. And he says also that in many ways, in that portion of the church, we baptize not only unto salvation, but we baptize into modern racism as a part of that. And so that it was a powerful understanding that when we're talking about modern racism, it has been part of the theological imagination of the church for hundreds of years. A couple of other things that I think have been important for me to understand historically on this issue, and I think we may elaborate on this in a bit, but there have been key incidents in U.S. history that have also impacted the white church and its blind eye toward racism. For example, the Civil War up at that point was a horrible missed, in addition to a tragedy, a missed theological crisis. And to that point in time, you had two armies fighting each other who were the most Christian armies in the history of the United States. But you had a fratricide, not just of brother on brother, but you had a fratricide of faith going on, and something we can share more about. But this was a time when theological reflection did not occur. Many great theological moments in our time have been forged in the horrors of war. The work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer after the terrors of Nazism, things like this. But in the history of the United States, there wasn't deep theological reflection about the conundrum that happens, that conundrum that's happened for hundreds of years when somebody that enslaves and is a part of a slaveholding society sees a person of color, a Black person specifically, become a brother or sister in faith. That in some ways indicts the whole system. How do I call you sister? How do I call you brother when I place you in the most inhumane of social hierarchies? The Civil War was an opportunity for that to happen, but for a variety of reasons, it did not happen in our society. Another significant moment that many of us we're still living in is in the formation of the modern political right, and particularly the white side of that. There has become a resurgent interest in natural law, the idea that there is a way that people are human, and society is designed and even structured to help us live out our most sense of humanness. And natural law has been used since the Enlightenment as a justification for racism. This is the way it is. This is the way people of color are different from more quote unquote dominant races. That resurgence of natural law, which is very highly represented on our Supreme Court now and a variety of places, has been part of this building coalition of modern colorblind racism. I've many times sat there and listened to the tape of Lee Atwater explaining to the Nixon's team in the White House that there was a series of words you could no longer use because those words didn't get you anywhere. As he said that, he said, you can't talk about segregation. You can't talk about busing. What you can talk about, though, is code switching to community schooling. We know what that means, but it doesn't use racist words. And this has been almost my whole lifetime is a time of colorblind racism where race isn't mentioned, it isn't described, and the undergirding logics of racism are rarely challenged in the public square. For many reasons, this has also become deeply attached with people's convictions of the market, how our society works, and how it is prosperous. So in our modern society, the more that the evangelical church has become connected with, I can define these terms, I don't know if you use them regularly, but this kind of neoliberal imagination that the market is the solution to all of our problems. The longer that that's happened, the more our racism has become embedded as normative and not seen in our society. So to me, that is, in many ways, when you're thinking about modern racism in the white evangelical church, there are so many deep historical roots that have fashioned a willingness to accept various forms of racism and to leave them unchallenged in many places in the church. What I say to many folks when I'm asked about what are responses that we can do, I'll give you 5 quick ones that can be talked about later. But one is that we desperately need a more embodied Christianity. We need a Christianity, particularly in those settings, that considers bodies as a part of our faith. In modern evangelicalism, the separation of the embodied realm from the spiritual realm has allowed travesties all over the world related to race. I also, in honor of a part of my profession, I think we need to become better historians and better anthropologists. We need to know these histories that have fashioned the world that we live in. Many times when you're talking about evangelical racism, you're talking about water to a fish or oxygen to a mammal. It's so normative that people lack the ability to understand the histories that brought that. The other thing that's been so significant to me is learning from other branches of the church. When we step outside that dominant white, particularly Protestant culture in the United States, there are deep streams of Christianity, some conservative, some not, but have windows on that breaks down our sense of this is oxygen or water. The Radical Reformation Church is one, but certainly the Black Church has to be leading the way on this because their positionality is so distinctly different. This goes back to Dr. Jennings and his powerful points, is that he says there's little that can change the world more than desire and relationship. The deep desire, the passionate desire to form relationship over the boundaries that we've created. Bob Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, illustrates this point that there's hope for even Christianity, because one of the things that's unique about Americans and our culture is that we literally move in and out of social groups, sometimes by marriage and friendship. He calls it the Aunt Sarah principle, is that too many times you want to launch on a misogynist or racist tirade, but then there's always a family member that you love that's indicted by what you're saying. And finally, I would just say that organizing and research is critical to this. The organizing work that Dr. Bishop Laney and I do in many ways creates a proximity to racism that makes it unmistakable. In some ways, that work, even though it's not intended as such, is the work of conversion for the church. So let me pause right there. I just wanted to nod to a couple of huge historical issues, and I wanted to leave this with just the simple thought that there are things that I think we can do. But I do think I'm so delighted that the broader work of Christ is desperately impaired by racism, and particularly white racism in the church. So thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to engage this in any way that you would like.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Conder. I think you did a tremendous job in a short time of capturing, in my mind, what are the complexities of the question we're dealing with, of why white evangelicals don't understand or embrace or grasp the Black struggle. I think it's important for our audience, maybe those of you who have just joined us, is that the topic for tonight is why white evangelicals don't understand the Black struggle. I also think it's important for the audience to know that the panelists tonight, all are members of the Church of God of Prophecy, a classic Pentecostal organization, which in many ways have been deemed to be the most diverse racially Pentecostal organization. So we come from the same spiritual formation, even theologically in some ways. I think it's also important to understand that for at least beginning of the 20th century, that Pentecostals and evangelicals were closely tied together, mostly because of doctrinal issues of the focus on conversion and spreading the gospel, those type of things. And probably since 42, when most Pentecostals, or a lot of major Pentecostal organizations became part of the National Evangelical Association, there was this link between Pentecostals and evangelicals to almost form one stream. But it must be said that probably since 2016 and the election of President Trump, that things seem to have taken a turn and created this tension that currently exists, and I think really precipitates this discussion. And I think you did a good job of maybe creating this nexus that can connect many of the questions that we're going to ask with what you've already covered. So our first question is going to be posed by Dr. Roger Ball. And again, hopefully this question will engender some further discussion, particularly prepared. So Dr. Ball.
Thank you very much, my brother. Dr. Conder, once again, thank you for doing a fine job in unpacking sort of some of the root history. I'm going to ask a layered questions, but I want to preface it just a little bit based on what some of what you just said. In part, if white evangelicalism is sort of at its foundation, you talk about sort of these missed opportunities, whether it was the Civil War, or I may even add the civil rights movements, or I may even add the election of 2016, of really missed opportunities for white evangelicals to really rise to the occasion and to really make a difference and to rewrite the ship in terms of their theology and how it is presented. Here is a question for you, sir. Should white evangelicals be seen as a religious aberration, something out of the normal, motivated by political agendas, or as a threat to the black struggle?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I saw that on the list. Just checking. I'm getting double mic feedback. Is that are we okay? Is that clear? Is my voice clear?
It's clear now. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, good, great. I feel very strongly that this is not a kind of a recent development and aberration, kind of a unique political agenda, because in many ways, even the political agendas that drive us now, I see them as having been developed over a long time. And so I do see this as a threat to the black struggle. I'm around many friends who fear with good concern an advent. I'll use a strong language on this, but Christofascism. There's a sense of there's a fear that Christianity can be easily mobilized or weaponized to not just undermine democracy, but anything that's authoritarian. As we look, I would struggle to find an example that would refute this. There's always been another. Authoritarian governments always need someone to blame. They and the kind of the history of rejecting immigrants, people of color, and certainly black people in our society. That history is from the very beginning, and it's always been bathed in a Christian logic. So to some degree, I think this is why this is a crisis, is that even when we're talking about things like neoliberalism or colorblind racism that are really unique developments of the last 40 or 50 years, they are developments on top of long logics that have been developed. So for me, I see this certainly as a deep threat, a threat to the gospel, a threat to the lives and safety of people in our society, and certainly something that has a deep thread of political interest in our society. And as people of faith, this is the kind of thing that I feel like we have to be prepared for and ready to step up in. I was challenged at one point in my own ministry in the 90s by a friend who was more socially active and more politically active. And he basically said, Tim, who are your enemies in the ministry that you lead? If people who profit out of racism or out of greed or any kind of abuse, if they don't feel that you're their enemy, then you're not confronting those issues. And in fact, that's really what led my planting of the church that was mentioned in the bio, Emmaus Way. Is I'd reached a point, and I was in a really large church, of saying there's nothing in this community that's changed because this very successful church is here. I mean, people love it. They come in the thousands, but there's no difference in housing. There's no difference in systemic racism because we're here. And for me, that was a real breaking point around 2004, 2005. Feeling like I needed to spend the rest of my career not only working for those issues, but being opposed or maybe even feared by people who profit from them. So that's a start, Roger. I'm certainly glad to hear other thoughts on this.
Dr. Conder? Yeah, just to follow up Roger's question, not a follow-up, just a query. I think all of us would agree to a great extent that no group is monolithic. And so when we talk about white evangelicals, I know we're not talking about a monolithic group, but when studies show that over 90% of evangelicals support Donald Trump, and thus, in my estimation, don't embrace the black struggle. In your estimation, is that true? Is that that large an extent of white evangelicals that are antagonistic to the struggle of Black people in America?
Mm-hmm. You know, I'll date myself here, but I was probably a first year college student at the University of North Carolina and poli-sci back in the day. And few people that remember the election of 1980. There was the sense that the professors that I had all expected roughly the white evangelical community to vote for Jimmy Carter. Because could you ever find somebody who was more committed to evangelicalism? A Sunday school teacher, a man who talked it, who walked it, who understood it. There was no 2 Corinthians from him. He was somebody who understood that. And there was a deep shock when white evangelicals went for Ronald Reagan. A campaign that began, I forget the name of, in the next county over in Mississippi, where the murder of civil rights workers were, talking about states' rights and talk about code switches. Everybody understood what he was talking about there. And so to some degree, that powerful, and that led to party switching. It was a political realignment of who called themselves Democrat and who called themselves Republican in our society. And in many ways, this agenda of disdain for the other was once again made very real. I'll give one quick analogy on this. I don't know if anybody knows Dr. Gene Nichols at the University of North Carolina. He's a constitutional law professor, and it had some notoriety for his research on poverty in North Carolina. And in fact, every time Dr. Nichols speaks, he has to offer a rejoinder that says, "I'm not speaking for the University of North Carolina right now with the words that I say." And our legislature literally shut down his Center for Poverty Research, even though it took no state funds. But one of the things that he said, just with Bishop Laney and I in a small group several months ago, was that, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you could talk to a politician of any ilk and say to them, there needs to be money spent for affordable housing or relief at the lowest economic earners in our society. And the answer you would get from many would be, you are exactly right. We need to do that. Now, we don't have any money right now, but perhaps next year we'll have funds to do that type of thing. 30 years later, when you ask someone, hey, we need to care for people who are minoritized or made vulnerable by their economics, the answer is, wow, helping them would be hurting them. This sense of kind of a neoliberal mindset that says that the market fixes everything, and people that are poor competitors by their own bad choices in our market system. That is something that is new. That notion that the market explains everything in our society is the product of our last 50 years or so. So to some degree, Trump is sitting on top of that 50-year movement. But when you look at Reagan, you look at the civil rights era, you look at the church, even some of the most esteemed systematic theologians in the 19th century defending enslavement, there's a thread that one can pull pretty comfortably through that.
Okay, thank you. Any other panelists with a follow-up question for Dr. Conder before we move on to the next question? Okay, if not, our second engaging question comes from Pastor Kenneth Benjamin, Jr.
Thank you, Bishop Carswell. Dr. Conder, thank you for joining us tonight. You mentioned the history of evangelicalism, and you shared how things have shifted or transitioned from one aspect to the next. And as Bishop Carswell shared, he talked a little bit about the politics of evangelicalism. So my question is, from a political position, how do white evangelicals reconcile their convictions with the obvious disregard for Black social issues or social issues that is for the common man? And when we look at that, let's keep in mind from a historical vantage point, men such as John Wesley, William Wilberforce, Bonhoeffer, those that you've mentioned. In today's context, we don't have those giants of previous years, but in that context today, these men in the 19th century used political movement to help shape and help the social issues for the blacks. So how do you think that works in today's society?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'll share on that, and love to hear your thoughts as well. This is one of the things that that Bishop Barber talks a lot about in the Poor People's Campaign, is the idea when he talks about being a third Reconstruction, in particularly in the South, the first Reconstruction being in many ways, I would say to white people, during the Monument era, right before. The late 1800s, early 1900s, the second being the movement led by Dr. King. And he's describing the development of a new people, and in many ways confounding them by naming himself as evangelical, a term that pastors of color, at least around me, have rarely used unto themselves. And so he is in many ways appealing. And when he talks about a third Reconstruction, he often goes back to the Third Great Awakening. That was before a real schism. And at that point in time, you had some of the great evangelists that you mentioned, utterly committed to saving souls, and also committed to social compassion in the wake of accelerating industrialization. And I think one of the reasons that he makes that comment is, and he does that very clearly claiming a Black prophetic structure, particularly a Black prophetic pastor, naming that there was a time when that schism hadn't happened. And you really look at, I don't know, there's a great book on this that I use all the time, George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture. And one of the things that he describes at great length is that 1880 to 1925 period, where evangelicalism and social concern and the growing social gospel became literally so different that it was hard to call them both Christianity, because they narrated such a radically different understanding of Christianity. Dr. Oops, I lost names here. Dr. Benjamin, right? You had another part of that question I wanted to comment on. Can you recall that? I was making the point that there's been this in the past.
Right.
You're asking, how do white evangelicals choose that identity?
Yes.
One other story that I think, this was in my research for my dissertation, that fascinated me is Dr. Rodney Sadler, who identifies as a Black Caribbean man, teaches at Union Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's PCUSA. He was a theological architect of the moral movement. And as it just began in North Carolina, I know that's a history some don't know, but North Carolina, as a purple state, truly a purple state, had passed around 2012 some of the most repressive measures toward suppression of the vote, closure of hospitals, unwillingness to expand Medicaid, all of these things. And this movement exploded from the NAACP out of that. So Dr. Sadler sat down and he got 8, 9, 10 clergy, mainly from Black church traditions in North Carolina. And they got about 20 to 25 of our state senators and our state House members who identified as evangelical Christians. They got them in a room and they said, we only have one question for you folks. That question is simply this: how do you morally and theologically justify your treatment of the most vulnerable in North Carolina? The numbers are very clear. Our inability to expand Medicaid leads to hundreds of deaths every year, thousands of deaths. I mean, people literally die. Do you understand that these policies are life and death policies? Do you understand, in the middle of a horrendous gerrymander, that more than half of our voters are blue, but we have 10 U.S. Congress people that are Republican and 3 are Democrats? And literally the person that drew the map said, the only reason that there's not 11 and 2 is I can't draw a map to make that happen. So as he asked them, why, how do you justify it morally? This would have been the moment when somebody might have pulled out a Bible, This would have been a moment when somebody might have said, let me tell you about my faith. Let me tell you about the pastor who came alongside me, who encouraged me, the church that nurtured me. But interestingly, two stories were told by everybody in the room. Everybody told their poverty story. Everybody told about walking 200 miles to school in the snow, even though there's no snow in North Carolina. They all tried to identify as people that were vulnerable. And then number two, they said we have a clear moral mission. And that moral mission comes from God, is we need to extinguish the New Deal and the Great Society in North Carolina. Those things need to be, that is what God is calling us to do. And so what you see in that type of answer is a complete politicization of the gospel in the language of historical political movements in North Carolina, in the United States, and particularly the identification of not just a market-based economic system. We're not talking about Keynesian economics that believes in the power of the state to broaden the lives of others. This is Chicago school economics that believes that the raw market is the only, ironically, divine hand in our society. And in sharing that story, I just say, I was horrified when I heard it, when I sat with Dr. Sadler, to hear how great the distance from a recognizable faith we've come from people who claim that faith and act in power. As Bishop Laney and I say this, is that as organizers, we live in a world where the government sector and the market sector have gotten so close that there's practically nothing the rest of us can do in the civic sector is rudely interrupt that conversation. And that to me is an example of how those two sectors have concocted a gospel that is really preaches a form of capitalism, not even just capitalism, that is life or death for people in our communities. That's a great question, by the way. Dr. Benjamin, you and I need to get a cup of coffee and talk for several hours.
I'm open to that. Thank you.
If I may just jump in while you're on mute, Caswell. So I think part of the and to that very question that the researcher, asked and brought those politicians and pastors together. I think again and again there's this idealism that at the heart of our Christianity and our Christian practice is Christ, right? And therefore, and then somewhere on the top, maybe like a lasagna or like a tres leche cake or something like that, that somewhere in there, that the politics and political ideology gets sprinkled in there. I think that's one of the dangers or dangerous beliefs that we oftentimes come to this conversation with. That somehow Christianity, as we know it, has been hijacked by political ideology. As you said, Dr. Conder, from the beginning, Abraham Kendi talks about stamped from the beginning, right? So from the beginning, what we do know is that the Eurocentric form of Christianity has been bathed in racism. And so if we really want to get to the conversation, it's not that racism and political ideology has been sprinkled along the way. It is at the very core of the praxis. And so, so in a real sense, it's not really, how can you with any moral consciousness really forsake the marginalized and the maligned and the poor and the disabled? It is the very people that we see that are marginalized and disenfranchised. It is the kind of Christianity from the very beginning that has formed these multiple societies. So it's not something that is after. It's something that is the foundation of what we do and believe in our praxis.
Roger, Pastor Ball, such a powerful point. I mean, I'm heeding back to one of my mentors, Dr. Jennings, who made this point so beautifully. But we constructed a black-white scale in our society, and black and white not as body phenotype. There are a million different phenotypes in between, but the position of blackness and the position of whiteness in our society. White being the most desired body to have, authored around white European bodies who discovered, found, and took. And that black-white scale, which is in many ways defined as immigration in the United States, right? The assimilation of people into whiteness. People forget that people who are Jewish, people who are Italian, people who are Irish were all deemed quote unquote black in that kind of scale of being not desired, not capable in our society. And one of the points that he makes so powerfully on that is that the black body was framed in the language of being reprobate, of being burnt, not saved. And so the black-white scale in our society, in the theological imagination of Europe in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, passed into our evangelicalism, was a judgment of salvation related to body types and body locations. And so in many ways, the black body as discovered by the early settlers and slavers was an unsaved body, a body that was reprobate. And in many ways, the displaced black body was the black body that was made close to Christ. And so in that evangelistic logic of the day, the idea was that the displacement, the removal of people from their homes, their locations, their animals, the places that define their lives, that actual removal was an act of God. And that is, Dr. Jennings, the idea that the notion of evangelism, which sits at the core historically of evangelicalism, and particularly in white evangelicalism, was crafted with a racial logic. Because again, when you think about the beginning of the settler colonial area, there's no such thing as evangelism up to that point, right? There are heretics and non-heretics, but the pastor of evangelism circa 1958 doesn't have any work to do. There's no one in Europe who claims broadly another religion. And it's only until the Moors invade in Spain and places like that with darker bodies does this logic become that the people who do not have faith and must be evangelized, and usually by the sword, are people of color. And so, as Pastor Ball says clearly, the notion of evangelism is crafted with racial logic that has solidified in American culture. And even when you talk about the advent of colorblind racism and neoliberalism, they're sitting on top of a logic that makes that make sense. When somebody says helping somebody who's poor is not helping them, there are hundreds of years of logic of saying when we remove bodies from their place, in some ways that was the only help that we could do for them. And it's horrifying. It's terrifying.
This is getting good. Wow. Well, we need to move on. I wanted to say one thing that will probably segue into the next question. I was having a conversation with, I think I was in North Carolina at the time with a pastor, and essentially he was saying that he was able to relate to the Black struggle, particularly the atrocity of Mr. Floyd's murder. He said, "I was with you until it started the looting, and then you lost me." You know, so it was if I'm with you in the struggle with your protest, but when this rage that they call Black rage, once you start exhibiting that, then that's when he said that we lost him at that point. But anyway, Sister Stephanie Scott is going to ask you the next question, and then you can probably opine on what I just said.
Yes, I wanted to just quickly make a comment. I'm loving the North Carolina relations here because I was born in North Carolina. That's my home. That's my family. Everybody's there. I also I follow Dr. William Barber myself. I'm just really in awe of his work, and I think that's wonderful to be a part of as well. My question is, I thought about the word acknowledge. To acknowledge something means to accept or admit the existence or the truth of. And I've personally witnessed during this time instances of people who I grew up knowing and caring for deeply for them. They deny that there are deeper issues for people of color. And I was thinking, why do you think it's so difficult for the white community to even acknowledge the Black experience and struggle?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think I'll see if I can. There are probably smarter people than me in the room. There's definitely smarter people than me in the room that can help us unpack this. But part of it is the curriculum has been broken from the very beginning, right? I mean, even in the United States, when we started universal schooling or began to nod toward that with common schools, right? The morality of common schools. There were two things that were really committed to. One was what they call Republican virtues, the ability to be able to democratically participate in society and also in its market. And then the other was white Protestant moralism, right? So white Protestant morality was a core of our curriculum as it formed. And you can see marginalized communities like indigenous people and others fighting against that curriculum constantly along the way. And as a result, the curriculum has always been a curriculum of white excuse, white supremacy, white justification, and white morality. So, for example, I was at a tragic funeral. I guess I'm getting older, but one of my dear high school friends had died, and this was 2 or 3 years ago. And I just sat with my friends at some point and asked them, similar to what had happened in Tulsa. We had a fusion government in Wilmington, North Carolina, that was overthrown by the Gatling gun, and with hundreds of people of color murdered. It was an elected government in Wilmington, North Carolina, one of the most dramatic events in U.S. history. And I asked this group of friends, all white, how many had heard of that? Not a single one had heard of the Wilmington Massacre. Something that you can bet that we've got some neighborhoods in Durham that if anybody rolled a gun through them, it would be national news forever. But this was the curriculum was not told at all, and so we don't know our history. And it's so easy, and it's intentional. It's not an accident. It's an omission that gives permission to continue a way of being. The other thing that one of the things I really, a couple of book recommendations. One is, I think Molly Worthen's book, Apostles of Reason, which is the crisis of authority in American evangelicalism, is an incredible read of the history of the logic behind evangelicalism. And one of the things that she says, to answer your question on this, is that the Christian, particularly evangelicals, community of natural law that basically says there is something that human beings need to achieve, an end, a telos. Often salvific language is part of that. This is what we're supposed to do. And society as a structure is a society has been structured by God to take us toward that end. And in many ways, what natural law does, and this will sound familiar to the world that we've lived in, is it can be neutered. The religious part of it can be taken out for political purposes. But this is kind of part of a white evangelical and white Catholic connection over issues like gay marriage and abortion that gave them the ability to say these things are unnatural. And in many ways, the move, as Dr. Worthen points out, ultimately breaks down the difference between facts and values. Because if our moral values are the way things are, then they indeed are the facts. There are no other facts, like the Wilmington Massacre in our community, or what has happened in Missouri, in all over the country that we've seen. Those things become not facts because they challenge the notion of what is of value in white evangelical Christianity. And what is of value is a world that's set up a certain way that helps me achieve my ends of salvation and otherwise. Which, ironically, if we all pulled our Bibles out, whenever Jesus was asked about how can one be saved, how can one control the salvation process, how can I make sure that I'm in and maybe Stephanie's into, but maybe not. How can I do that? Jesus never answered that question. He always told a story that confounded the logic that produced the question in the first place. And in many ways, that's the natural law world that has become so predominant. Particularly, I have a son in law school. He would say this has become dominant in the way that we're reading the law right now. And so for white evangelicals to question how society works is for them to, in many ways, question the whole presupposition of what their faith is formed on without really questioning, is our faith formed on the right principle on this? And some of them, they're right. But Dr. Stephanie, this is, again, one of those answers that's horrifying to me.
Thank you for that. I agree.
Wow. So what I'm going to do is, next few minutes, I'm going to ask you from our audience, if you have a question, put it in the chat. We'll have time for at least 2 questions. And while you're doing that, while waiting for those questions, I'm going to ask if any other panelists want to chime in on the previous question asked.
I want to just touch on what Dr. Conder was just sharing. Can segue to this. In all that you just said, why does the truth scare the white community or white evangelicals? We're not even going to touch on the QAnons and all of those. But why is it that truth scares them, such as when you talk about the Tulsa massacre, or you talk about critical race theory, or the 1619 project? Many historians would write or have written, even religious scholars who are evangelicals have written that slavery began in the United States in 1619. So why is it that all of a sudden now we have amnesia? When the truth comes to the surface, why are they afraid?
Yeah, I have nothing but a thumb up for that sentiment that we are deeply afraid. We are. I'll speak, venture speaking out of whiteness. There is a fear of a history that is not only deeply shameful, but it's one that it's destructive to every community. And I was as a PhD student, I was in a critical theory, critical race group. I was I was only white male in that group. It was a very, very diverse thing. And I listened to my friends, my professor friends who are now in their 5th to 9th year of teaching around the country. And many of them teach critical race theory. And they're literally getting grants canceled and pressure from on high not to teach critical race theory in education schools that are formed on democratic practice, equity, and now critical race theory. So, boy, that has struck a nerve, right? I don't know that I'd ever heard the term critical race theory until maybe 12 or 13 years ago. And then all of a sudden, this has become an explosive defense. And it goes back to this notion of anti-Americanism. A parallel in history to read is in the Western United States on bilingualism and how schools are managed in California, Oregon, and Washington State as territories, because they all had an inconvenient fact in the 19th century. They weren't segregated, and as a result, the Department of Education and our government needed to craft a logic of its own history and intent to be able to segregate those schools. That was shocking to me to hear that. And so the defensiveness is deeply formed and historically formed.
I was listening to you talk earlier also, Dr. Conder, and I thought about how in South Africa they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that's something that we never did in this country. Mm-hmm. And I think that really speaks to how, the 1800s and then going into the 1960s and these kinds of things, we keep having the same issues arise because we never dealt with the initial issues. And there was never, we cannot acknowledge truth. And because of that, we can't progress.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Stephanie, that's such a great point. I mean, my goodness, that we haven't had that reckoning yet. Some of the issues in criminal justice reform and otherwise are producing that conversation in locations, but we're talking a broad sweeping national conversation, and it has been rejected.
Okay, we have one question so far from the audience. It comes from Pastor Jacqueline Kahinde, who pastors in North Carolina, a good friend, and she asks, "Is there any interest in the church in correcting the wrong?"
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I can say this. I held focus groups with pastors this past spring as a part of this school that I lead, and we asked them questions about what they felt like they needed to learn related to social change. We told them that we were committed to understanding the things we've been talking about together tonight: a critical history, a true, authentic history of where we come from, and a wrestling with their identity, with their historical roots. And it's interesting. One of the things that was universally said by this group of clergy, I think I would say 14 pastors that were white and 3 that identified Black, is they all had a deep interest in the conversation that we're having tonight. And so in some ways that is encouraging. The challenge is they also want to control sometimes the entry points, right? Some want to say, yeah, I want a little bit. I want a little bit of Bishop Laney, but not full orb Bishop Laney, right? Because I know what's over Bishop Laney's right shoulder. Those are historical bills of sale from, was it Charleston Bishop Laney? Yeah, and so
Yes.
they want what Bishop Laney represents in our society and our community, and they understand that his racial understanding, his positional, his racial position is critical. But on the other hand, sometimes they don't want to really do the kind of historical work. So it's a mixed bag. But I do think there is enough interest that denominations like yours can, as you're doing right now, can press the uncomfortable conversation. Even though it will at times, create distance from some. I'm delighted that you're doing it, because racism kills all of us. It just kills some faster than others.
Okay, I think there's one more question. This will be the last one from the audience. It comes from Kami Cannon, which is also from North Carolina. It says, in regards to understanding the Black struggle, how does a church reconcile the fact that they played a large part in the oppression of Blacks?
Mm-hmm. My first thought on this is how important this question is. I chose to kind of continue my education in a secular setting, anthropology and religion and education, and I was around in a social justice committed program that freely talks about the history, and sometimes in many ways can be dismissive of Christianity as a whole. But that for them was always the litmus question for someone like myself, whether it was writing or speaking or just working or researching with them as friends, is where do you stand in terms of that recognition? Are you willing to acknowledge the role of the church in the historical oppression of Blacks? And this is the church that refuses to acknowledge that question I think is going to face a reckoning. I'm sure most of you guys have read statistics on secularization and how significantly that's playing out. And I think there are 2 reasons why we're secularizing so quickly, because I know a lot of 20-somethings who want to come to church and would love to come to church and love to come to your churches and would come to your churches. But their dominant questions are, will your church change the social fabric of the world that we're in? Because we don't have time for things that aren't doing that. I think that's one of their questions. And the other is, will you be truthful about the history that we're in? And particularly for white churches, will this be a fragile institution that's always explaining and always deferring to the lowest common denominator of fear on looking at the racial question, or will you be honest about those things? I think that's probably if asked to consult with somebody who's trying to pastor to a 20-something, I think those would be the two things I would say to them.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Conder. Well,
Yes.
our time is far spent, and what I want our audience to understand that this is just the beginning of these conversations. I'm sure we could spend a couple more days on this, but this is just a beginning point of these conversations that we hope will continue. With that said, I'm going to invite Dr. Clarence Laney Jr., who will give us our closing remarks and any reminders. Bishop Laney, Dr. Laney.
Thank you, Bishop Leonard, and thank you, Dr. Conder, for your insight. Thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for your time. We all have been encouraged. We all have been challenged, and many of us are recommitting ourselves to this work of justice. So thank you again, Dr. Conder, for your expertise in bringing this to our conversation on this evening. On next week, the conversation will continue, critical conversations on race. On next Wednesday, we will have the Dr. Melva Sampson, who is the Assistant Professor of Preaching and Practical Theology at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. And the topic will be Defying the Overseer, Maintaining the Black Church Prophetic Tradition. So that will be an insightful conversation, one that is very, very much needed, particularly in the context of our denomination where we serve. So we invite you to come back on next Wednesday, and the subsequent Wednesday, we will wrap all of this up, which is the last Wednesday in October, with the topic, where do we go from here? So invite somebody, let them know that we are on each Thursday evening at 7 p.m. I would encourage you, let us not grow weary in doing what is well, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. So again, to our panelists, we thank you for your presence. Dr. Conder, welcome you. We hope that we will welcome you back into our setting again very, very soon. And so Dr. Conder, who is a very good friend of mine, I owe you lunch, dinner, or something, and I will make good of it for the group. So again, are there any other parting questions or comments before we leave from the general panel?
No, again,
right.
just my personal thanks to Dr. Conder. I think he was just so captivating to me. I mean, his breadth of knowledge and experience really embellished his conversation, and I'm glad he took the time out to join us tonight. And I just pray God's richest blessings upon him and his continued work.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Amen.
I second the motion.
Amen. All right. The conversation will be next Thursday here on Facebook Live at 7 p.m. All right. Thank you all for joining us. Go with God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, guard your hearts and guard your minds through Jesus Christ. Have a pleasant good evening.